QSO Today, episode 288, Guy Lemieux VE2BWL. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that they have just the right rig for contesters, DXers, and ragchewers. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. My thanks to ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. Last week, in my email message to my dear listeners, I wrote that I was inspired by my guest Fred Schramm, K2HA, to finally pull the trigger on creating a QSO Today tour of Israel that would be kind of like a tour bus de-expedition. Fred has already started to arrange his tour next year. If you have an interest in coming to Israel as part of a 10-day tour in and around May 2021, with other hams that could include but not limited to some ham radio operations in beautiful parts of the country, as well as lectures, workshops, barbecue with Israeli hams, etc., while touring Israel, please fill out the form by clicking on the show notes banner called QSO Today Israel Tour 2021. As we progress, I'll keep you up to date. Guy Lemieux VE2BWL had a chance to build his dream contest station in a rural area of Southern Quebec while attempting to relax in the evenings and weekends from a stressful career. His project was to build his own 110-foot self-supporting tower from a pile of new metal stock delivered to his barn. Guy shares this project and the stories behind his 7-tower contest station in this QSO Today. VE2BWL, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Guy?
Yes, I am. 4Z1UG, this is Victor Echo 2, Bravo Whiskey Lima. Good morning.
Good morning, Guy. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Okay, very good. Well, I was born in Lake Megantic, a small town in southern Quebec near the U.S. border. The state of Maine, actually. And unfortunately, Lake Megantic got known because in 2013, there was a train wreck that killed 47 people and destroyed the center of town. And that's where I was born, and that's where I spent my youth. Now, Lake Megantic was a small town of about 6,000 people, and the main industries there were wood processing, cutting trees and doing planks and plywood and that sort of thing. But there were two places in the town that were of interest to me. One was the telegraph office at the train station. And then the other one was the airport, where they had a weather station and an air radio and a low-frequency beacon, and they were operating around the clock. In terms of technology, that was it. By about the age of 8, we had an AM radio, which had the shortwave broadcast bands. And I started listening to that for long hours, trying to identify stations in various countries. And I only spoke French then, so I was missing a good part of what was happening. But at age 11, I met an operator at the airport that spoke French, and he was a ham. So that was my first interaction with amateur radio. His name was Richard Laflèche, was his name. This call was Victor Echo 2 Lima Yankee. And he had a boarding room at my grandparents' house. And in his room was a DX20 and a trio receiver and a long wire in the yard. And I was just fascinated when he operated his station in CW. And then I started to learn Morse code. And I spent many weekends, as much as I could, at the airport. And within a few years, I was fairly fluent in English, learned basic electronics, weather observations, and basic air traffic control.
And how did the people at the airport, how did they respond to an 11-year-old kid who hung around the airport?
I guess they were, it was a very small airport, one of those airports that were built during the war, every 60 miles or so, so that planes that were ferrying from Western Canada could stop by in case of emergency. So it wasn't a big airport, but it was the operators were always very, very kind in terms of their time. And I, they started teaching me all kinds of things. So first in French, and then after that with other operators that were mostly English speaking. So I started learning basic electronics from them, weather observations, and that sort of thing. And about that same time, my father brought for me a hand key and a sounder and 2 large batteries on a very nice piece of wood, all very well laid out. So I started doing CW with a sounder, a telegraph sounder. But I fairly soon thereafter, I got an oscillator with one tube, and I started learning it the right way for AM radio. Now, when I was about 13, Richard got transferred, and then a English-speaking operator, and by then I was okay with that. He was a ham and became my second Elmer, and his name was John Kennedy. Now, he was also transferred within a year, and left by myself basically to prepare for the exam. And you needed to be 15 years old to get your ticket in Canada. So anyway, within a few months after turning 15, my father drove me 70 miles to the nearest DOT office, that the Department of Transport in those days. And the basic exam consisted of sending and receiving 15 words per minute, drawing 5 schematics, doing or answering questions on electronic theory and regulations. And there were no multiple choices exams then. So I passed the code exam, the theory exam, but did not explain the schematics well enough. And the examiner, who was called an inspector then, sent me back home and told me to return in a year. And that was a tough approach. Could have been discouraging, although he was technically right to do that. I still needed to learn. And there were no clubs in this little town. And other than the couple of hams that I've met, that was it.
What year was this?
That would have been in 1960.
Did your library have any resources like ARRL books or other electronic books?
Yes. In fact, not the library itself, but Richard had given me a handbook circa 1958, I think, something like that. So that was my basis for learning. But again, I didn't have any guidance, and I did not understand everything properly, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that it took me a little while to get back to pass an exam. And I was in college in Quebec City, and then at the University of Sherbrooke, where the same DOT office was easier to reach. So at that point in 1965, I got my basic ticket, CW only on HF at age 20, and then the advanced ticket a year later, and that was 55 years ago.
Now, what was your call sign, your first call sign, you remember?
Victor Echo 2 Bravo Whiskey Lima. I've been holding this for 55 years.
Wow, okay, and then the upgrade also didn't change the call sign, just the privileges.
No, we did not have the novice type approach where you had an N in your call and then changed when you changed class.
So as a basic ticket in Canada in 1965, were you able to use all bands but CW only?
Yes, that's correct. HF, that gave you HF privileges, and in fact, it gave you VHF as well and UHF. but there were really no repeaters in those times.
And you had voice privileges above 140 megahertz?
No, indeed. With the basic ticket, you could do that indeed.
Okay, so you get your first license, age 20. You're in college. What was the first rig?
My first rig was an AR3 receiver, which I built, but I soon replaced it with a National NC-190 when I got the license. And the transmitter was a Canadian Army 19 set, brand new out of the box. There was lots of surplus equipment then. So I had that for probably a year and a half. And then upgraded to a more complete station.
Now, was that 19 set, was that multi-band?
No, that was, if I recall, was 80 meters, or maybe 80 and 40, but it was a low band, per se.
Kind of like the ARC radios of the time.
Yes.
These are all World War II surplus.
Absolutely. And since they were available, throughout, I guess, many surplus stores, that's where I got mine, and it was next to nothing in terms of purchasing that. So that went. That was a good radio to start with, but as soon as you got more active with many bands, I guess had to upgrade.
Now, you're in college already. Was this interest in electronics and radio instrumental in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Oh, yes, very much so. I wanted to be an engineer, and I did 2 years of a 5 years program at the University of Sherbrooke. But I found out that engineering was not for me. I graduated 3 years later in 1970 in business administrations from Laval University in Quebec City. However, all my summer jobs were in technology, and I spent my career mostly in telecom. Now, I was a bit of an oddball in a graduating class of over 180 people in business administration. All of my colleagues went to accounting, marketing, stockbrokers jobs, that sort of thing. But I started with a degree as a central office foreman with Bell Canada. And my telecom roadmap after that was that I did long-distance line carriers, microwave maintenance, switching, step-by-step crossbar, 4-wire ESS, that sort of things. I went into marketing and sales, staff support, long-term planning, new systems introduction, that sort of thing. I worked for, as well, Northern Telecom in manufacturing of analog and digital transmission systems, fiber optics, sales to major accounts. So the career was basically started with radio. And I finished this in 2001 as the CEO of Bell Mobility Radio, a Bell Canada enterprise company, catering to police, fire, ambulances, large government land mobile networks in Quebec and Ontario.
You're a telephone guy through and through.
Oh, absolutely. It started with, the wires connected to a box, right up to the introduction of digital technology and new protocols and all kinds of new advances. So I really did managing of technical people, technicians, engineers, and so on, throughout. And I guess the various departments I worked with, of course, allowed me to eventually become a CEO of one of their company. And ending up in radio was really sort of closing the whole circle.
Well, that's kind of an amazing story. One of the things that, maybe this is a tangent and aside, is that I think that every once in a while it's nice to appreciate that the end-user equipment that comes from telephone companies, the telephone, The industry has made an extraordinary effort to make sure that it's always backwards compatible. As you mentioned earlier, you go from Stroger to Step to Crossbar to number 5 ESS, all the stuff. The stuff at the end of the copper wires still works, regardless of the change of technology in the central office.
Oh, absolutely. In those days, they had all kinds of concepts about, if you're making a call from New York to San Francisco, the levels have got to be the right one. And there was a lot of analog systems tweaking in those days in order to make sure that the levels were right. This got a bit less complicated using digital technology, because then I guess you're sort of processing signals and then sending data streams across the network. But for sure, there was a great attention given to being able to retrofit your equipment as you went along, and the speed at which changes were occurring was pretty startling. Within a few years, you had new equipment, more sophisticated, faster, and so on and so forth. And I think that the same thing is continuing to happen today.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get outside and be active with ICOM's new IC705 HF to UHF portable transceiver and its optional multifunction backpack. This is ICOM's perfect solution for SOTA and parks on the air. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion with its base station features and functionality at the tips of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds. This beautiful new rig has RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz, and includes a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with a live band scope and waterfall display. Unbelievable. The radio is 5 watts with its internal battery and 10 watts with an external 13.8-volt power supply. This full-featured radio operates on single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Included in this package is a micro USB connector, Bluetooth to support linking to your smartphone or Bluetooth headset, built-in Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone, which is standard equipment. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 with plenty of room for antennas, cables, and other gear to get you on the air from the mountaintop or the local park. There is a link to this amazing new rig on the QSO Today podcast website for this episode, and when you order your new ICOM IC705 from your favorite ham radio dealer, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. Was Bell Canada part of the Bell system in America? And so, therefore, did they have the resources of the Bell Laboratories as their source of technology?
Oh, absolutely. As a young manager then, I went on several courses in Morristown, New Jersey, and I don't remember all the places, but I probably attended about 10 different courses in various cities. So we were very much part of the Bell systems and needed to be in North America to be compatible with the numbering systems and interfacing with similar technology and so on and so forth. So that was a big thing that the Bell system did, which was basically making sure that the system would work, continent-wise and worldwide.
Are you retired now?
I am, yes. I am sort of. After leaving Bell, I went on to manage two startup companies, one in telemetry and one in semiconductors. And in 2008, after selling the last company, I started doing coaching for CEOs in technology companies. And I've been doing that pretty well since. Now, I don't work as much as I did at the beginning. I used to have up to 12 companies that I was coaching. And coaching the CEO means sometimes coaching as well the executive team, and sometimes certain departments. But now I still have a couple of companies located here in the area, and I've been finding that CEOs today, just the way I was back then, need pretty well the same type of support that I wish I had then. Now coaching is better organized in this area, at least, and I guess throughout the U.S. and Canada.
I think that there's also an attitude, perhaps now, maybe it's the self-help attitude that may not have been around at the time that you were becoming a new CEO, but I think that CEOs now are kind of willing to admit that they actually need some help.
Yes, you're right.
It makes an opportunity for a seasoned, retired CEO to be a coach.
Absolutely. And coaching basically is, you've got, nothing has changed really. It's lonely at the top. You've got responsibilities that sometimes you cannot share with others, maybe with your wife even. When you have somebody to talk to, and that's basically what I'm doing, asking questions, making sure that whatever you have as a plan in your head, that when you start articulating this, that it's going to make sense. And sometimes just the fact that you're doing that as a CEO and as a president or whatever, I guess going to help you, present it in a better fashion, sell it in a better fashion, and then organize your company also in a more optimized fashion.
So that means that you're still kind of busy.
I am still busy, yes. Between the hobby, getting calls and visiting companies and that sort of thing, yes, I'm still doing that.
Now, you sent me a message in preparation for this QSO that you had always had a modest station from the mid-'60s through 1990. What kind of stations did you have in those days?
Well, if I look at the list of rigs that I had, other than the heat kit at the beginning, like the SB300 and SB400, then I got an FT10. I basically changed rigs every 8 to 10 years. So I got an FT101 and then an ICOM, that was a Yaesu, and an ICOM 701A with a tuner. And then I got a Kenwood, a TS950 SD. And then in 1992, things changed a bit because I started building this huge station. But up to then, I had basically city lots. I was changing jobs quite often, changing cities, changing parts of city. I lived in the Montreal area in 3 different places. So there was that sort of constrains me to a little space for antennas. And I never had the time to really settle down and build a tower. So I suppose that the more you are constrained like this, then the pent-up demand for directional antennas increases. And that's why, having small station, low power, this sort of thing, then at some point in time, I really wanted to have something bigger.
So what changed after 1990? Because you kind of mentioned that something shifted. What was that shift?
Okay, so in 1992, as I became the CEO of Bell Mobility Radio, that lasted 9 years, by the way, I bought a 56-acre piece of land on top of a hill with the idea of putting up a tower at last with a multiband beam. And I visited Noel, Victor Echo 2 Hotel Quebec, very well-known contester. And he had built from a Rhone design 3 100-foot self-supporting towers and some very sturdy monobenders, including a 3 elements huge 80-meter beam. So here I am with a large piece of land, with a separate workshop, a barn where I could store tower parts so I can build my own towers. Now, I never had any metal working experience. And I said to myself, why not learn that? So I bought a large press drill, a metal rotary saw, motorized chain blocks. I just avoided going into buying soldering equipment because that was a different skill anyway. So I decided to build just a tower like Noel had done. So I ordered 3.5 tons of angle bars and pipes delivered in front of my garage. And I brought everything inside by hand, one bar at a time, and spent parts of weekends and vacations building that tower. After a year, I only had the base, a 20-foot section done, which was weighing 1,800 pounds. Now, that was crazy by then. I said, I'll never finish this. But I'm not a quitter. And I wanted to see a finished product anyway. During that time, I was turning the company that I inherited around. It was quite tough. So doing this project took my mind away from problems during weekends and vacations. And altogether, it took 3 years. And it got more encouraging as the sections were getting smaller. And I heard some help along the way to mostly to do painting. I did paint this thing with 3 coats, one primer coat and then 2 coats of epoxy paint.
Can we be clear here for a second? What you're talking about is you are actually building by hand your own self-supporting 100-foot towers, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so you had mentioned Rhone a little bit earlier when you mentioned Noel, but you had the raw material delivered to your barn, and you decided that you were going to build 1 or 3 towers?
Well, at the onset, I thought I could do 3 towers, but no. In fact, I wanted to have 2 of them. So the first one I did build by myself in those 3 years. And then the second one I did buy from Noel and repainted it and then put up the second one.
But to build a 100-foot self-supporting meant that the base of that tower was actually quite large.
Yeah, that was 13 feet across, roughly, on the triangle.
Right. This isn't Rhone 45. This is a big project.
Oh, yes, absolutely. There was a commercial tower. Just assembling this created all kinds of challenges because I was working mostly alone. So it required pulleys and winches and things like that just to hold these bars on top and of course, ladders to bolt things and so on. So I learned precision in terms of boring holes, installing it. And then, of course, the theory of vectors is always helping when you do things like that, because sometimes you feel that you should raise a certain part and no, you should lower it and that sort of thing. So anyway.
I'm going to interrupt you again because you just said also earlier that you weren't soldering. Where I come from, I think you meant welding. That means that this whole tower was nuts and bolts and holes?
That is correct.
Right? There was nothing welded here. You were assembling this like an erector set.
Basically, yes. The welding that needed to be done was the end of the sections and also some of the attachment plates to bolt those bars. So I would be bringing that basically those tower sides to a welding shop, and then they do it for me.
It took you 3 years to put this tower up?
That is correct. So on the one morning, I got a 35-ton crane to come up the hill and just set up alongside the tower. And then we raised it, put it on I had already put it on its base, the first 20-foot section. And then we put the last 100 feet on it, including, of course, the rotor. And the rotors on these were prop pitches. And the mast was 4.5 inches diameter. So it was a big project, but it was exciting to see the end result.
So the tower could survive the winter. What about the other hardware? Because when I think of Quebec, I think of the snowstorms I've been in there. What else did you put on the tower in order to survive the winter?
Basically, nothing else. The towers did stand, the 15 years that I was there. They, the paint, one of them needed to be repainted after about, 12 years, which I did during a summer with the help of somebody that did start from the top and came down. It took about maybe a couple of weeks to do altogether. But other than that, once it was sitting on its pods, it was there was very little maintenance. The best way to do this would have been to galvanize the tower, but I did not do that at the time.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. Okay, so now you have 120-foot tower in your yard. It seems to me that probably this was going to be used for something more than rag chewing. What happened after that?
Well, first of all, I needed some antennas to put on this. So on the first tower was in 1997. The second one happened in 1999. But on that first tower, I did install a 6-element monobander on 20 meters with a 46-foot boom. That was at roughly 120 feet. And then on top of that, I did put a 6-element monobander 15 meters on a 46-foot boom at 130 feet. And then I started building a couple of smaller towers. In fact, I assembled them. I didn't build them per se. I purchased them. So I did buy a 72-footer to hold a 6-element monobander on 17 meters on a 36-foot boom, and then a 5-element monobander on 12 meters on a 26-foot boom at 52 feet, and then a 5-element monobander on 10 meters on a 24-foot boom at 52 feet. And finally, before doing so, that was between 1998 and 1999. So I did add a 3-element monobander on 30 meters on a 36-foot boom at 72 feet. So by then, I basically had a pretty good station, except that I was still missing 40 meters. So that other tower that I purchased from Noel, I did assemble a 3-element monobander on 40 meters on a 52-foot boom, and that was at 120 feet. In addition to that, these were the monobanders. Then I had an 80-meter full-size loop at 110 feet, a 160-meter inverted V at 110 feet, a 160-meter sloper to Europe at 110 feet, and a couple of beverages, 2 wavelengths long on 160 meters. These were 1,150 feet. So I had basically built in 2000 a full DX station, and I was operating only with 200 watts. I had an L4 amplifier for a period of about 2 months. I turned it on about 2-3 times, never used it, and I broke pileups throughout the world. I did not need, mind you, we were at the top of the cycle then. So I really did not need any more power than 200 watts. And it was just a great station to work on DX. And in that period of time, I basically did my DXCC on pretty well all the bands. Got the honor roll as well. Anyway, it was an absolutely great experience.
Well, it sounds great. You know, what comes to mind as you're talking about this project, because I see how these projects go for me. I've never done anything that large because I don't have the space. But what occurs to me, I grew up in a garage with a father who worked on cars. And so, we'd start a car project in the garage, and you'd get to a point where all of a sudden you don't have the right tool. And so I'm imagining you're this guy that has this barn and on all this property, and you have all of this raw stock delivered to you. Did your need for equipment and tools to be able to handle this stuff, did that kind of evolve over time, or did you have a list of all the stuff that you needed even before you started so that you were kind of like ready to handle a massive tower sections and things like this?
Eric, I did not know what I was getting into. And as a result, I knew I needed a couple of pieces of equipment like a metal saw. But, as you continue your project and you face new challenges, I guess then you start equipping yourself. Now, I was quite fortunate that I had one metal shop not very far from my country place then, that was able to help me with certain needs as I was going along. And then, of course, maintaining all this equipment requires some special equipment. So I did build a winch that was capable of raising up to about 1.5 tons. My antennas, the 40-meter beam, did weigh about 450 pounds. So the winch would bring a 40-meter beam up the tower in about half an hour. And you had to, of course, the rigger had to follow it along. So I had a guy that stayed for me, and he still works with me now, and he's a professional rigger. He started over 25 years ago with me at that site, and still now climbs my tower, and some of our friends' towers as well. So he became pretty adept in sort of avoiding mechanical problems that we had because of high wind, because of ice, because of all kinds of things like that.
So in this particular case, in this kind of a project, it's good to have mentors and friends to kind of help you along for a number of reasons. One, to ensure the project's success, but also to ensure that you're not harmed in any way.
Oh, yes, very much so. And so that's why, Noel, first of all, because he had done this by himself, was very helpful to give me some of the tools, suggestions to avoid errors that he had made. And of course, I got to know a good deal of people that were specialized in, pouring concrete and building bases and forms and things like that. So there was definitely a need to draw on people, and I had also engineers that were building professional systems, and so once in a while I was having discussions with them. They were working for me at the time, but they would give me some good pointers as to what to do in order to optimize my efforts.
Now, you said in correspondence to me that contesting was a life-changing drug. How did you get into contesting, and how was it like a drug?
Well, I started contesting a bit when I was at that last site. This was I called it Bunker because it was on Bunker Hill, not very far from where I live now. My first attempts after doing DX of contesting were very interesting because I discovered a program called it was a Morse trainer program done by a Canadian, actually, a VE3. I just have a blank now, but it will come back to me. And so I started doing a bit of contesting with that station. But on Bunker, I did not have any automation. I just had the remote antenna switches and the whole layout, because I had basically from the house to the first field, which was up the hill, there was about 150 feet. And then going up to the top of the hill, I had about 400 feet of feed line. And the feed line basically were dedicated to the field. So I had one for the first field and one for the second field. And then I had the antenna switches at the end of this to switch 6 antennas in each field. So that was not very conducive to doing contesting. I did it, but just for sort of for fun. So when we decided to leave the place, and I tried to sell it to hams, but I didn't have any takers, so I had to dismantle most of it. I just left one tower there, which was bought by an internet provider. So I started building a station where I am, and I could not put a 120-foot tower there. So I have a more modest station from that standpoint, but I needed to now automate this more. So I had 2 radios, actually, an FTDX 5000 and a K3. And I did start buying equipment in order to allow you to transmit on different frequencies without interfering with one of the radio. And I started, so I bought a micro-WAM MK2R Plus for doing SO2R, and then the associated filters and the band switching, automatic band switching, and all of this was put into a console where it was there's a screen in the middle, a radio on the right, a radio on the left, and then you start operating SO2R. Meaning basically a single operator and 2 radio. And so you put the right radio on your right ear, and then the left radio on your left ear and your headphones. And then when you run on one radio, but when things become a bit, how can I say, slow, then you start chasing for QSOs on a different band. And now you try to work the one on the left side while trying to run on the right side, and so on and so forth. And I found this difficult. I don't know if it's because of the way my brain is done or how it has to do anything with age. I don't know. But in spite of the fact that there are some very good videos on this, Randy K5ZD did 3 fantastic videos on this, and they're available on YouTube. Well, I couldn't really get it right. But at the same time, I started doing some one contest actually as a multi-single station, meaning that you've got multi-operators and one radio. And I did this with Lemieux VE2BWL Echo Kilo, who is a local ham, local friend. And then other local hams came. Pierre, Victor Alpha 2 Charlie Zulu, he's a superb CW operator. Chris, Victor Echo 2 Charlie Alpha Quebec, is a superb phone operator. And Donald, Victor Echo 2 India Radio, IR, had never contested, but he's a very good CW operator. So I started inviting them, and we started getting into all the major contests, the CQ Worldwide and the WPX and the WAE and all the major ones. And they started learning, and I learned quite a bit as well, how to manage this. And then the first thing we know, after a year and a half of doing this, things got a bit more serious. We were doing it for fun at the beginning. Winning was not that important. Mind you, you cannot, with a station like I have, compete with K3LR and some of the major stations around in either here or in Europe. Because I could have possibly done that with the former station I had, but not now. So we started winning, sections like Quebec and then Canada, and then getting, fairly high scores in North America, but never in the world. But being more serious at it, more competitive, meant spending more time in front of the radio, not wasting time, getting better operators, and so on and so forth.
Can we go back to SO2R for just a second?
Sure.
You mentioned that you couldn't master it. I just had a recent conversation with Ward Silver, N0AX. In fact, a few episodes ago, I even replayed his original interview where he talked about SO2R. And what struck me at the time that Ward said it, and then listening to you, is that you actually had 2 different kinds of radios that you're running SO2R on, right? You're running the Yaesu FTDX 5000 and the Elecraft K3. What Ward said to me is that he actually used 2 radios that were identical, because for some reason he felt that if he was working on identical radios, he was able to kind of go from one to the other without having to kind of think about how to tune the radio or which buttons to push, because they were both the same on each one. Do you think that might have made a difference in terms of your SO2R operation?
Well, I think Ward is right about that. But I don't think it would have made a big difference in my case. I think it has to do with how you think, there are certain people that are very good at drumming, and they can have, different independent movements on their with their arms and so on. My feeling is that even if I would have worked a lot on it, I guess I would have become better, but certainly not as good as some of the people that have been doing this for many, many years. But the thing that is important here, I think, is not necessarily that point, but the fact that I got diverted with operators that just enjoyed doing multi-single at this station and were willing to come every major contest and help improve the whole station at the same time.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. So then I saw a thread in a online forum where you were talking about converting from SO2R to M2. Is that what we're talking about here? M2 is like multi-operator 2 stations, or multi-operator M1 is multi-operator 1 station?
Well, one station, if you operate one station in major contests, you can actually operate a second radio with several operators, but for a period of time, just chasing multipliers. So, in other words, if you have a second radio that is working independently from the first one on a different antenna, for example, then you can work those mults that you would normally not being able to work just because you're, let's say, working 20 meters running. So it takes another operator to do that. While as SO2R, you're trying to do this by yourself with 2 radios. You see the difference?
Yeah, I do see the difference. But it also sounds to me like it's a lot more fun. I mean, the fact that you can invite people in to keep the station going through the entire contest gives you a little bit of a break along the way, but it's also much more social and kind of, teamwork.
Absolutely. I got it to a point where at the last CQ Worldwide SSB, my friend John K9EL came from Chicago just for the weekend. And then Rob, DL7VOA, came from Berlin, Germany, just for the weekend. And Brian, K1LI, who lives about an hour from me in northern Vermont, along with 4 local operators, came by. And we did this pretty well, something similar in CW a month later, where George, W1EBI, came from the Boston area, and Brian, again, from northern Vermont, and Pierre, VA2CZ, and Donald, VE2IR. And we have been improving our scores year over year, in spite of the fact that the conditions have been worse and worse every year. So there's a few reasons for this. The fact that we're together as a team certainly helps. The operator skills did improve. We made some station improvements as well. Antennas, layout, preparation for each contest. I call it on-the-job training when I'm at the beginning, particularly when I'm with them. And we've also joined the Yankee Clipper Contest Club in Boston. And we're now a Canadian area of YCCC because we're within the circle of the club. And just going down to meetings of YCCC has been an education for all of us. And those guys have been helping our tenure as well in contests. So basically, in the last 6 months, I went from an SO2R station to a M2 station. What I need now is more operators that can operate, running and then, of course, chasing multipliers with the second station. Well, we're working on that.
So for a weekend contest, like a CQ Worldwide, for example, how many operators could you use in your station with 2 operating positions?
Basically, I would need at least 6, and the better would be 8, so that you cover during the night. There's not as much of a necessity for that, But I would say that with 8 operators, you can pretty well cover, the whole contest and basically be fresh when you sit down in front of a radio for an hour or two. And then, of course, you take your turns, and at the end, I guess your score tends to remain, or at least your performance tends to remain at a certain optimum during the 24 hours or 48 hours.
I saw on your QRZ page that you mentioned that you have an apex loop receiving array, and you state that it's the best antenna that you've ever had. Can you describe what that antenna is and why you think it's so good?
Well, I had beverages before, and beverages are fairly simple to build, except that you need the space, and I had the acreage for that before. So the Apex Loop is a great concept. Actually, it's being sold by a fairly large supplier here in North America, and it has basically 4 quadrants and an amplifier at the base of the antenna, and you can actually switch the direction. The receiving direction of your antenna into 8 different positions. So north, northeast, east, southeast, and that sort of thing. And you can actually flip it as well. So here in North America, if I'm working Europe, which is northeast, and somebody is calling, and by the way, I use it mostly on 160, a bit on 80, because on 80 I have a pair of phased arrays that gives me northeast to southwest. But on 160, it allows me to listen to Europe. But then if I hear a faint signal from the U.S. or maybe the Pacific, then I just flip it, and just a touch of a button, and then I can copy better on that side. And this is hooked to the RX antenna of the radio. So it works absolutely great. It minimizes the noise. It gives you directivity that you don't have with a one or even a double beverage, that works on both sides. And it is a great tool to improve scores and communications. Just chatting, for example, on 160 meters. So it's a great addition to this station.
Guy, you've been a regular listener to the QSO Today podcast for at least a few years now. I'm just wondering, I've often mentioned on the QSO Today podcast that sometimes we say that the solar cycle is at its bottom, and so therefore there's just no way to make contacts. But it seems to me that every contest weekend, there are people making contacts. Do you see this as true, and that in fact maybe the effect of the solar cycle, not saying that there isn't an effect, and there is obviously a large effect, but that the solar cycle being at the bottom shouldn't keep people from operating?
Oh, absolutely. The advantage of contest weekends is that I guess there's more people on the air, and when a band opens up, well, then you notice it fairly rapidly if you're monitoring, the DX Summit or DX Heat or whatever. But the one proof of that is the introduction of FT8 and now FT4. I mean, it certainly, you cannot hear any CW signals on 10 meters, and yet there are contacts being done there. And when you've got propagation on 6 meters, it's the same thing. So if people were calling more, I guess we'd make more contacts. People tend to listen more than they transmit, of course. But the concentration of the stations during a contest weekend, of course, makes the band, or at least seem to be more open. But yet, during regular days, unless there is a solar storm or something like that, I guess the propagation is there, and QSOs can be done.
I found an article in French, so everyone who is a French speaker, forgive my French, online from Radio Amateur du Quebec that showed pictures of your ham shack, your antenna farm, and the battery backup system and what looked like a rack of automation. Can you describe what you have in the basement or in the garage that's actually backup powering the system that you have, and how much automation you may have involved in it?
Okay. At the current site where I am, it's pretty well the same thing that I had before. So I have two large... let's talk first of all about powering the computers and the radios on AC. So I have currently 3 UPS system that do provide power for the FTDX 5000 and the 3 computers that I'm using right now. Then I've got plenty of 12-volt equipment around, like station masters or some of the filters and so on that are powered by 12 volts. So I have 2 50 amps linear power supplies that are feeding batteries, very large batteries. They weigh about 100 pounds each. These are the batteries that are used in computer centers, and I have switching systems on them that whenever there is a power failure, the batteries come on automatically, and without any break in voltage, and then I just keep being operational whenever there is a power failure. In addition to that, I did add a generator, a 14,000 watts generator that starts at about a 10 to 13 second interval. So as soon as there is a power failure, I just have to wait a bit. Nothing goes off except the amplifier. The amplifiers I did not put on emergency power for that short period of time. But as soon as the generator kicks in, then I am totally operational.
So, in other words, all the electronics is on the back end of the UPS. The UPSs are taking commercial power, generator power, and the big batteries are floating across the UPS. Is that right?
The big batteries are flowing from the power supplies to the batteries and then to the 12-volt distribution in the station, okay? So the UPS are just to power the computers, which are not being powered by 12 volts.
So they have a dual duty and are using the UPS to do the charging of those batteries at the same time, or do you actually have...
No, I have chargers for that. So they get charged, they get floated all the time by the 50 amp power supplies.
Do you find that with those kinds of batteries, are those lead acid batteries?
Yes, they are.
Do you cycle them just to make sure that they actually have a chance to discharge a bit and then recharge so that they actually will last a little bit longer?
Yes, I've been doing that, not as often as required. I think I'm probably living a bit dangerously as far as that goes, but I do that maybe twice a year.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Well, I guess there's the imminent disappearance of older operators and a need to recruit new ones. I guess we're doing our modest part to get more people to operate in contests, for example. Last year I got called by an Army officer that wanted to have a bit of help to prepare for a inter-army, friendly armies, that is, U.S., Canada, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. And they wanted to improve their score. And when I gave them a few tips as to how to build their antennas, they did that and came number 3 in their category as opposed to being at the end of the pack. And when I visited them during that 36-hour exercise, which looked like a field day, all with great generators and tents and so on and so forth, they wanted to know if we could help them to in getting their ticket. So we finally graduated 9 Army recruits last year, and 3 came to operate in contests, and 6 are learning CW. So when I hear that people are not getting into the hobby because of CW, well, now that's not the case, of course, but you got more people learning CW, and of course the exercise was so interesting for the armed forces that they decided to do it again. And last week we graduated another 6 operators with full HF privilege. So these will be operators and they have already started operating here, and they will the new breed of operators will also do that. So I think that there's a need to do that. And I listened to one of your recent podcasts with Fred, AB10C,
right,
which was absolutely great, the way that they've been doing this in the Nashua area. I'll have to talk to Fred at some point in time, because they have some great tips about recruiting and retaining new ops and the like. There are all kinds of ways to improve the recruitment, but there's certainly one thing that I've seen that is common whenever we start talking about recruiting. And we've got to get back to some basics. And I know that somebody talked lately about getting older radios back on the air and that sort of thing. That's a great way. But also the fact that you actually transmit a signal from your antenna to Japan and make a contact, whether it is an FT4 or FT8 or CW or voice, it doesn't matter. You've made a contact one-to-one. And that's one thing that we've got to keep explaining and repeating. So that's certainly, that's one of the concern. But I'm quite confident that technology, the way it improves, the fact that, of course, this coming cycle is going to be quite exciting for many that have never experienced that. That's going to improve things a bit. Not to take anything away from what the U.S. has done, for example, with Homeland Security and natural disasters and so on.
But they still rely on hams a lot of times to be able to actually make that last connection. I still say perhaps that, amateur radio, we can make a contact from here to Japan without $1 trillion worth of infrastructure that supports the smartphones and the internet and everything else. I just read this week that SpaceX has put up another 24 satellites that's supposed to be a constellation of 24,000 satellites when they're all done, in order to do that conversation from Japan to America. So I guess, as ham radio operators, we can point to SpaceX and say, well, we don't need a constellation of 24,000 satellites. We can just do it with a piece of wire hanging out the window and make that contact around the world. What was interesting about what you were saying about the Army, though, is that one of the things that maybe we don't do enough of is to show people, frankly, how practical amateur radio is in terms of being able to solve problems, or maybe to put us in the mindset of solving problems. What do you think about that?
Well, I did meet with the higher ups that that are in charge of that regiment, and they told me that what we brought as ham operators to that group of specialists in Army communications is exactly that. The fact that they can use some of our tools to configure antennas, or at least design antennas, simulation of antennas, and so on. Even new ways of soldering plugs on the coax. Understanding a bit more how things are working, and then of course getting different skills in contests. Army contests are basically on a channel. So it's the people that, or at least the station that has the most power, that sort of takes the frequency. In this case here, we've got to contend with all kinds of interference, QRM, and so on the band. So there is definitely a number of new ways and new areas that are being offered to people that are basically doing it for doing the same thing, but on different channels.
In different services. What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
Well, basically, a number of things. I guess the fact that there is more contesters in spite of worst propagations conditions on HF. Just the fact that we're just about to turn this whole thing around, at least the sun is going to allow us to turn things around. Just imagine the growing opportunities in the next 8 to 10 years for DXing, rack chewing, and contesting. What I find exciting, although I'm not necessarily inclined to do that, I've done it a bit, but it doesn't interest me that much to do FT8 and FT4. But what was invented here is certainly something that's going to help. And I'm very optimistic about the fact that new technology, better radios, the new ways of doing things will keep the hobby, or at least the amount of people in the hobby, active. I think that one of the problems we've got is that many hams are not active anymore, and we're starting to get to them in our little region here, and we're going to try to get them on the air more. I can understand that somebody that hasn't been on the air for 10, 15, 20 years doesn't have a radio, won't get on the air tomorrow morning, but they can certainly operate here in contests, or just rag chewing an afternoon on 20 meters. And that's the sort of thing that we have to do. So it's not only up to them to start. We've got to bring them back into the hobby, get them on the air.
Oh, I think you're so right. In my little town of Efrat here, just south of Jerusalem, I can think of at least 8 licensed ham radio operators. That doesn't include me and 4X1TQ, but I can think of 8 others that are off the air and have been off the air for some time. And I bet everybody can think of hams in their neighborhood or in their area that have been off the air for a while. And wouldn't that be amazing if we could just bring those all back on?
Exactly.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Well, again, get on the air, of course, but find an Elmer. I mean, I have not found a single guy around here that's been operating with us, and we've got monthly dinners on Friday night, that sort of thing. But we're not an organized club. Sometimes I'm thinking, well, I should do that, but I've been into larger clubs, and right now we have some people that have the same community of interests. So we've got all starters and people that dedicate themselves to either contesting or VHF, DMR, that sort of thing. And but if you're by yourself, and I had an opportunity to do that lately. Somebody called. He immigrated to Canada from Belgium. Got his ticket here, but got both of them because he had the background, electrical engineering, to pass the test. But he called just to say, well, I don't know what to do now. I guess, how do I get on the air? How do I initiate QSOs and that sort of thing? And his name is Patrick, and his call letters is VA2 Papa Hotel Kilo. And Patrick came here for about 3.5 hours the first time, and then repeated that another time. And first thing you know, he's on the air, and he's doing contacts. So you either get an helper to help you, or we as Elmers ought to go and do that. And all my friends around here that have stations, operating stations, have been doing that. And if we can do this in a less populated area, imagine what you can do in major cities.
That is absolutely true. Guy Lemieux, VE2BWL, I want to thank you so much for agreeing to come on the QSO Today podcast. What a pleasure it's been. I'm astonished, actually, by your 120-foot tower project, but it doesn't surprise me. I'm just so happy that you were able to meet with me today and have this QSO.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, for this opportunity to talk. And thank you for the many thinkers and leaders for whom you provided a chance to express themselves and share their vision. I truly appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Guy. 73,
Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Guy. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in VE2BWL in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support for these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at the checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 300. QSO Today is now available in iHeartRadio and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. Special thanks to Ben Bresky, who now edits the audio for this QSO Today podcast from the audio pieces that I give him. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.